In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at how to do simple animation. Now, as before, we have our screen set up and we also have our game loop. Now, before we start looking at the code, let's actually consider a game loop. Now, every game loop kind of works the same way. We check for input from the user, whether they press a key, mouse, or however they're controlling the game. We have to update positions of all the sprites if they've moved a little bit, and also do any game logic. Has anything collided? Do I need to perform any actions? Once I've done all that calculation, we then draw the frame. Okay, and that keeps looping over and over again. So our game loop is set up like so. So first of all, I'm checking for input. At the moment, all I'm doing is check for X, check to see if users quit or not. Okay, I'm not doing anything else. I then have got this update position code. Now, rather than actually having a static circle, so I'm just going to execute this code so you can see what it does. So instead of just having a static circle, I've got one that's slowly making its way across the screen. Now, in order to do this, I need to put the position of that circle into two variables, an X variable and a Y. So the position of my ball is stored in these two variables. I'll come on to line 8 later. So update position essentially is adding 1 to the X value of the circle. So it's basically moving at every single frame 1 pixel to the right. Now, my draw ellipse, as you've seen in previous tutorials, is almost identical. The only difference is I've now changed the X and Y position to be variables rather than static values. Which means every time this loops, because I'm always changing X, that causes it to move across. If I wanted it to move diagonally, I could do something like this. I have 1 to Y and 1 to X. As you see, it's now going in a diagonal pattern. I can add different amounts to each of these to control which angle it goes at. See, that's now going a bit steeper. If I wanted it to go steeper still, maybe add full to it. You can see it's going steeper. Let's leave that too. So animation is actually quite straightforward. The only thing you have to think about is having the position of whatever you're animating in variables. The other thing to consider is this funny line of code which limits it to 30 frames per second, animation timer.tick. And at the top here I've got animation timer equals time.clock. What this bit of code is doing is limiting how fast the game loop runs. Essentially, by limiting it to 30 frames per second, the program times how long it took the previous call to draw and to run this game loop, and then it only makes sure it runs enough to get that kind of 30 frames per second. If I remove it out and run it, you'll see, or don't see in that case, that it's just moving well too fast. It's essentially, because the code is very simple, I've got quite a powerful computer, it's just running so fast you can't even physically see it. If I run it again, you can see the green circle was on there for like a millisecond. I can change this to maybe limit to 2 frames per second, and you'll see just how slow that gets. If I increase the frames per second, maybe 100 frames per second, you can see that makes it a lot smoother, and obviously means that the animation will be quicker. One thing to bear in mind about frames per second is that if your scene, the thing you're drawing, is too complicated, then it might not be physically possible to draw it 100 times in a second. Okay, it does depend on what you're doing. For the code that we are practicing at the moment, it's so simple that we can set frames per second to be pretty much any value we want to.